I remember the exact moment he said it, like a scar carved across my memory in slow motion. We were sitting on a mattress placed directly on the hardwood floor of a third-story walk-up that smelled faintly of old paint and boiled rice. The window was cracked, not for the breeze, but because it never quite closed properly. He was leaning against the wall, bare-chested, cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth like he was some misunderstood artist waiting to be discovered. I was folding brochures for a property course I was doing online for free, one of those late-night dreams I clung to while working double shifts just to afford groceries, and I made the mistake of saying it out loud, soft and honest. One day I want to own a house, a small one, with a tree out front and maybe a stone path. Nothing fancy. He laughed. It wasn't just a chuckle or a scoff. It was a full-bodied, from-the-gut kind of laughter, cruel and raw, the kind that rolls through the air and sticks to your skin long after the sound is gone. He didn't even look up from his phone. "You dream too big for someone with nothing," he said, and took another drag. "You'll never have more than this floor and me." I remember nodding slowly, pretending I wasn't wounded, but the truth was it went deeper than any argument we ever had. It wasn't the words alone. It was the way he said them with certainty, like a prophecy, like the world had already cast its vote and my future was a closed case. That was Alex. Charming when he wanted to be. A storm when he didn't. I met him at a local poetry night, where he was reciting some half-written Bukowski imitation that made him look like a tortured intellectual to every woman in the room. I was there alone, trying to feel something after weeks of numb routine. He came up to me after his set, told me I had eyes that didn't blink enough, whatever that meant, and within weeks he was living in my apartment, eating my groceries, using my car, and calling my bed his. I didn't see the shift at first. It started with small things. Him teasing the way I mispronounced certain words, or joking that I'd never be able to run a business because I was too polite. He called it honesty. I called it love at the time, because I thought love meant accepting everything. Eventually, I stopped telling him about my goals. I kept them folded like old receipts in the corners of my mind, slowly fading with time and silence. Every time I'd bring up the possibility of saving for something, anything, he'd remind me of the debt we were already in, which, funny enough, wasn't mine to begin with. The cable bill, the electricity, the loan for the old car he swore he'd fix, all in my name. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. He said his credit was messy, and I wanted to believe in us, so I agreed. It felt like commitment, like a joint future. It wasn't until he started skipping job interviews and coming home with the smell of bars on his clothes that I realized the joint future only existed in my head. He was always full of plans, grandiose, vague, always starting next week. But when it came to action, it was always me taking on more shifts, selling my clothes online, scraping change from under the couch cushions just to keep the lights on. And all the while, he laughed. At me, at my books, at my hopes. "You'll never be more than a cashier with a vision board," he once said after I came home with a small ficus plant and called it Step 1. But even then, I stayed. I stayed because I thought leaving meant failure, and I had already been told so many times that I couldn't make it on my own that I began to believe it. When you hear someone call you useless long enough, you start to echo it in your sleep. And it wasn't just his words. It was how he made me feel like my only value was in how much I could carry. Emotionally, financially, logistically. He'd forget birthdays, forget my schedule, forget conversations, but never forgot to remind me that I was lucky to have him. "No one else would put up with you," he'd say, and I clung to those crumbs of affection like they were meals. Because in between the storms, there were brief moments when he held my face and said I was the only thing keeping him sane. Those were the hardest moments to walk away from, not because they were true, but because I needed them to be. The day he left, he didn't slam the door. He didn't cry or beg. He just took the keys to the car, said he was going to see a friend, and never came back. He texted 3 days later, "I'm done. Don't try to find me." That was it. No closure, no apology, just silence and a mailbox full of overdue notices addressed to me. The ficus was dead. The electricity was cut a week later. And as I sat in that cold apartment, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled like his cologne. All I could think about was that laugh, that prophecy, that smirk that said I was nothing. But what he didn't know, what I barely knew at the time, was that something had ignited in me the moment he walked out. Not rage, not grief, something deeper, a slow, deliberate hunger. A need not just to prove him wrong, but to become so completely outside his version of me that even my shadow wouldn't recognize who I used to be. I didn't know how yet. I didn't even have a plan, but I made a promise to myself that night, whispering it into the silence like a spell. I will own a house one day, and when I do, it will have a tree out front and a stone path. And if he ever shows up again, I won't need to say a word, because the life around me will do all the talking. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruel trick of it. If he had screamed in my face the first week, or emptied my bank account on day one, maybe I would have had the sense to run. But narcissists rarely strike with thunder. They come like fog, soft at first, then thick and choking. The apartment we moved into wasn't much, but at the time I thought it was a new chapter. 2 people starting from scratch. I brought what little furniture I had. He brought nothing but boxes full of books he'd never read, and a charm that made everyone forgive his lack of contribution. "It's temporary," he said, when I paid the deposit with the last of my savings. "Once my new job kicks in, I'll cover everything." That was the first promise. A clean, empty sentence that sat in the air like incense and disappeared when the rent came due. He insisted we put everything in my name. "It's just easier," he reasoned, wrapping his arms around me like that made it okay. "Your credit's better. Mine's got some history." I laughed then, thinking we were in it together, like some Bonnie and Clyde for the working class. I didn't understand yet that Clyde never planned to pull his weight. He just needed a name to hide behind. The lease, the internet, the electricity, even the loan for that ancient sedan he wanted so badly. All under mine. And I was proud of it, in some backwards way. Proud that I could hold things together for us. Proud that I was the responsible one, even as I drowned in paper cuts made of bills. His job never came. Every week there was another excuse. The hiring manager was shady. The hours didn't line up. They didn't respect his creative energy. Instead, he stayed home, sprawled across the couch I had paid to have delivered, smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and scrolling through forums about startup culture, like he was incubating the next billion-dollar idea. He told me I didn't understand vision, that real change takes time, that I was too linear, too focused on structure. "You think houses and savings accounts make you happy," he'd say, condescending. "But that's slave thinking. You're chasing security, not freedom." Meanwhile, I was chasing overdue rent notices with tip money from my 3rd closing shift at the diner. Still, I made it work. I split pills in half to stretch my prescriptions, stopped using the dryer to save on electricity, walked instead of taking buses. I'd come home to find him asleep in the middle of the day, or out drinking with friends who never paid for anything but always knew what I should be doing differently. "You're lucky," one of them once told me at a barbecue I didn't want to host. "Most girls don't get someone this passionate." Passionate. That's what they called it when he screamed about the world being broken and blamed capitalism for the fact that our refrigerator was always half empty. It got darker when I started asking questions. "Are you going to pay for the car this month? Did you call the landlord about the plumbing?" He'd twist everything. Accuse me of attacking him, of not believing in him, of being just like everyone else who gave up too early. He'd sulk for days, give me the cold shoulder like a punishment, and then, just when I was about to break, he'd whisper apologies with those eyes that made me forget every red flag. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm just stressed. I want to give you the world, but you keep reminding me I haven't yet." He always knew how to keep me halfway between doubt and guilt. It was a trap, and I kept walking into it like it was home. Then came the letters. Not the handwritten kind. The ones with red stamps and formal threats. The ones that said final notice and action required. I hid them at first, pretended I could fix it before it broke completely, but I was bleeding from too many wounds at once. He blamed me for letting things get out of control, said if I had just relaxed more, if I wasn't always stressed, we'd be doing better. "Money is just paper," he said once, after maxing out the credit card on new headphones. "You can't take it with you." No, I thought, but I was starting to understand that debt doesn't wait for you to die. It eats you alive, slowly, in interest rates and insomnia. He was slipping away by then. Not physically, yet, but in his eyes. In the way he no longer looked at me like I was a partner. I became the background to his excuses. The woman who cooked, cleaned, paid, and still apologized. I'd catch him smiling at his phone, typing fast and lying slow. He said it was just a friend, someone he met online. You wouldn't get it, he mumbled once when I asked who she was. She's ambitious, like me. That was the night I slept on the floor, not because there was nowhere else, but because I couldn't stand the weight of his breath beside me anymore. He left a week later. No fight, no slammed doors. Just a quiet morning when I woke up and found the keys gone, the car missing, and a shoebox full of receipts I never agreed to tucked under the table. He didn't even take his books. Just disappeared, like a ghost who had never believed in haunting. And he left me with it all. The rent due, the bills stacked, the bank calls. The sedan he swore he'd fix was repossessed under my name. I tried to explain to the creditor that I hadn't driven it once, but they didn't care. Paper trails are indifferent to betrayal. I sat in that apartment for 2 weeks after he vanished. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep without hearing his voice in my head, laughing, mocking, judging. I'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror and see someone else. Someone gaunt and unfamiliar, with eyes too tired to fight. I had $137 in my checking account, no family nearby, and a job that didn't even cover minimum payments. But I had one thing left. My name. And it was drowning in someone else's lies. That was the moment I understood what survival really looked like. Not dramatic, not glamorous, but slow, deliberate, and ugly. You don't rise from ashes like a phoenix. You crawl from them, burned, coughing, dragging everything that tried to bury you. I taped every bill to the wall like a war map. I made a list of what I owed, what I owned, and what I'd have to become to make the math work. And then I opened my computer, logged back into that free real estate course I had abandoned months earlier, and started again. He had taken everything but my will, and that I would make cost him later. Not in flames or vengeance, but in silence. In the life I would build without him. A life so distant from his version of me that if he ever showed up again, I wouldn't even need to say, "I told you so." I'd just smile and let the space between us say it for me. The morning after he vanished was too quiet. Not peaceful, not serene. Just hollow. A void that echoed every movement I made, every breath that left my lungs and bounced off the cracked walls. The kind of silence that has weight, that sits on your shoulders like a judgment. The coffee pot still had half the grounds from the day before, dried at the bottom like someone had forgotten they existed. His shoes were still by the door. I stared at them for hours, thinking he might come back for them, might knock like some contrite ghost and say it had all been a misunderstanding. But he didn't. Of course he didn't. The only thing that moved was the ceiling fan above me, one blade slightly bent, wobbling just enough to make a soft thud-thud-thud, that in time started to sound like mocking applause, as if the apartment itself was clapping at my stupidity. I remember standing in the center of that tiny living room, barefoot on cold laminate flooring, and realizing I had no idea what time it was, or what day. My phone had died overnight, and I hadn't bothered to charge it. What was the point? I already knew what it would say. Missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, reminders of bills I couldn't pay, maybe a text from someone at work asking why I hadn't shown up. I hadn't told anyone he left. Not yet. There's a peculiar shame in being left behind, even when everyone told you it would happen. I didn't want to hear the told-you-sos. I didn't want the pity. I just wanted the silence to stop pressing against my ears like a vacuum. He took nothing of value. That's what haunted me most. Not because there was much to take, but because even the little things he had once claimed mattered, meant nothing to him in the end. His books, the one guitar he said he'd fix, the hoodie that still smelled like bonfire smoke from a trip we once took to a campground 2 hours away, all left behind like abandoned skins. The bedroom was stripped, but not in a clean way, just scattered, drawers pulled half open, clothes in a pile that looked like they'd been kicked over in a rush. I found one of his old notebooks under the bed, the kind he used to fill with quotes and half-thoughts and doodles he said were Concepts for future stories. I flipped through the pages and they were empty. Every single one. Blank. Just like the promises he'd made. I went to the fridge and opened it like I might find something there that had changed overnight. But it was the same barren landscape. A half carton of expired milk, one cracked egg, and a container of rice that had turned gray. I sat on the kitchen floor, knees pulled to my chest, and cried without sound. The kind of cry that doesn't need volume to be heard. I thought about the time we danced in that very room. No music, just him humming and me spinning because it was a Tuesday and we were drunk and stupid and pretending we were happy. And now the only music was the electric hum of the refrigerator working too hard for nothing. The first envelope I opened was from the credit union. Overdue car payment, 31 days late. Final notice. The second was the gas bill, red stamped and cold in its tone. I shuffled through a dozen more before I stopped counting. I didn't even remember agreeing to half the things my name was now tied to. And yet there it was. Printed, inked, official. The debt was mine. Legally, emotionally, spiritually. Every dream I'd whispered into the night, every plan I'd made with my eyes closed tight just so I could see a future that didn't hurt, all of it was buried under reminders that I had been naive enough to trust him with my identity. Not just my heart, my name, my signature, my legal personhood. I started cleaning the next day, not because I felt better, but because there was nothing else to do. The dust from the drywall patch he never finished was caked in the corners. I vacuumed the floor 3 times and still felt the grit beneath my feet. The air smelled like stale ash and lemon-scented cleaner, a clash of what he left and what I was trying to force into existence. I scrubbed the kitchen tiles until my fingers bled, then stared at the red water spiraling down the sink like some twisted metaphor. I told myself that if I could just make the place clean, I could pretend it was never tainted, that he'd never slept on that mattress, never thrown that mug during an argument, never laughed at me while I cried over a bank statement. I found a half-used can of white paint in the closet and began covering the scuff marks on the wall. I didn't tape the edges or lay down sheets. I just painted. Fast. Furious. Like I could erase him with every stroke. The color didn't even match. But it felt good. It felt like movement. And when I was done, hours later, I sat on the floor again, this time facing the wall, and whispered the names of the bills aloud like I was performing an exorcism. Rent, gas, car loan, credit card, medical. I didn't cry this time. I made myself say thank you. Thank you for showing me what it looks like when someone subtracts from your life. Thank you for leaving before I forgot how to breathe without permission. In the weeks that followed, I worked without rest. I picked up double shifts, sometimes triple, took on cleaning jobs after hours, and watched the sun rise from bus stops with my knuckles raw from bleach and cold air. I pawned what jewelry I had, sold my books, and even considered selling the apartment furniture. But I couldn't let go of the table. It was the first thing I bought by myself, long before him. A small wooden table with uneven legs, and a single drawer that stuck when it rained. I kept it, not because of sentiment, but because I needed something in the room that hadn't betrayed me. I started sleeping better after the 3rd week, not because the weight lifted. It didn't. But because I had made peace with the idea that no one was coming to save me. That kind of clarity, however cruel, is also freeing. I began writing things down. Every debt, every deadline, every step it would take to get out. The list was long, overwhelming. But I taped it to the fridge and looked at it every morning like a prayer. He had left me with nothing but a mess and my name attached to it. But I still had that name. It hadn't collapsed, even if I had. And somehow, that meant it could still carry something else. Something new. Something clean. The silence in the apartment eventually changed. It wasn't so heavy anymore. It became mine. I filled it with my voice. Soft at first. Just humming while I did the dishes. Then music. Then the sound of phone calls with financial advisors, with banks, with women at community centers who knew what it was like to have been erased and left to put the pieces back together. I told no one the full story. Not yet. It was too raw, too complex. But I stopped lying. When people asked if I was okay, I said, not yet. And somehow that truth made me stronger than any mask I'd worn while he was still in my life. The apartment remained bare for a long time. No art, no rugs, just necessities. But slowly, I began to bring in pieces that mattered. A lamp from a thrift store that gave the room a golden hue, a mug with a chipped handle that said, "Future Homeowner," a plant that didn't die. Every object was a choice, every item a reclamation. He had left me surrounded by dust and doubt. But with every scrubbed tile, every paid bill, every silent night where I did not cry, I was building something louder than any apology he never gave me. I was building me. The human body has a strange way of adapting when survival becomes routine. It stops demanding luxury, sleep, softness. It only asks for function. I don't remember exactly when I stopped dreaming in color, or when fatigue became so constant that I mistook it for normalcy. But I remember standing on the bus at 5:40 a.m., pressed between strangers with damp coats and coffee breath, swaying with the jolts like I was part of the steel itself. I would drift off between stops, eyes open, mind hovering in some strange middle place, too tired to sleep, but too hollow to stay awake. That was how I began most days, standing in a moving box, headed toward the first job that barely covered the minimum payments on a life someone else had set on fire and walked away from. I cleaned offices first, silent floors before dawn, empty desks where I imagined people with salaries and lunch breaks would soon sit. I wore gloves that smelled like ammonia and scrubbed keyboards, doorknobs, toilets, floors. The silence was surgical. I liked it. No one asking questions. No one knowing I once cried into the very rag I used to wipe down executive conference tables. Then I'd change in a gas station bathroom into something slightly less stained and head to the diner. Second job. 8-hour shifts, sometimes 10, pouring coffee and memorizing the names of regulars who thought my smile was part of the service. They called me sweetheart, honey miss. They never saw my hands shaking when I took their orders. My feet blistered inside worn-out sneakers, my apron pocket full of coins and unpaid moments of rest. Between shifts, I studied real estate law, marketing principles. I watched YouTube videos with captions because I couldn't afford headphones after mine broke. I kept a notebook with me, tucked behind the register, where I jotted down ideas between table clearings. House plans, budget strategies, savings milestones. I had a goal, $25,000. It felt like trying to hold the ocean in a teacup, but I broke it into pieces, weekly targets, monthly markers. Every tip I got went into a separate envelope marked future. If I received a $5 bill, I'd pretend it was a seed, one that would one day sprout into a doormat with my name on it. I refused to believe that poverty was my story's final chapter. I'd already lived the part where the man I trusted left me in ruins. I wasn't going to let his prophecy be true. By nightfall, I worked remotely as a virtual assistant for a woman in Arizona who ran an online bookstore. I answered emails, processed refunds, updated listings. She never saw my face. She didn't know I sometimes typed half asleep, with wrists stiff from wiping counters and ankles swollen from standing too long. But she paid on time, and that was more grace than most people offered me back then. I'd finish around 1 a.m., eat toast if I had it, and sleep on a mattress pushed against the corner of the living room because I had sold the bed frame to pay the phone bill. I didn't decorate the walls. It didn't feel like a place for beauty. It felt like a tunnel, tight, dark, but going somewhere if I kept crawling. There were nights I broke, nights when I sat on the bathroom floor and whispered to myself, asking what the point was. What kind of future I thought I was buying with burnt coffee and broken cuticles. Sometimes his voice would creep in. That laugh, that smirk, that cold certainty that I was reaching for something I'd never grasp. "You're a dreamer," he once said with disdain. "But the world's made of concrete." And yet, it was that same dreaming that kept me moving. I began to see my exhaustion not as a weight, but as proof. Proof that I was trying. That I was building a structure brick by brick, where he had left me rubble. Every paycheck, however small, was a defiance. Every payment I made on the debt he left was an exorcism. I stopped answering calls from people who only wanted to check if I was still miserable. Misery porn, I called it. The ones who said, "You should just file for bankruptcy," or "Maybe you should move back home," without understanding that my dignity was the only thing I hadn't pawned. I chose this fight because it was mine. For once, mine. No man's shadow, no pity handout strings. Just me and the resolve I grew like scar tissue around every broken promise. Around the 6-month mark, something shifted. My credit score ticked up by 11 points. I got a small refund check from the bookstore job due to a clerical error. And one morning, after 3 buses and a cold walk, my supervisor at the diner told me I was the most reliable person she'd ever hired. She said it offhandedly, pouring cream into her coffee, but I went into the walk-in freezer and cried against the stacks of frozen beef patties. It was the first time in over a year someone had acknowledged my worth without strings attached. That night, I allowed myself to sleep 6 full hours without setting an alarm. The world didn't end. I woke up late and still made it to work. A small miracle. With time, I opened a high-yield savings account. Automatic deposits, no matter how small. I labeled it freedom. I didn't touch it, not even when the rent was overdue or when the power company threatened disconnection. That account was sacred. It was where I placed every penny he said I'd never have, where I buried every insult, every eye roll, every time he told me I was too sensitive or not realistic. That account was proof that his voice no longer lived rent-free in my head. I let my actions do the speaking now. Silently, relentlessly. I avoided men for a long time, not because I hated them, but because I needed to love myself enough first to recognize who was worth letting in. I learned to identify red flags without justifying them. I became fluent in boundary setting. I learned that love doesn't come in the form of disbelief or mockery, that no one who respects you will ever make you feel like your dreams are foolish, that sometimes the most dangerous man is the one who tells you you're lucky to have him, while watching you carry the weight of 2 lives. After a year and 3 months, I had saved $11,470. I didn't celebrate, not out loud, but I bought a small silver necklace with a tiny house charm on it, wore it tucked under my shirt, like a secret contract between me and my future. People noticed the shift in me. My posture changed. I started saying no without apology. I didn't offer explanations for my choices. I no longer walked with my eyes on the ground. I looked people in the eye, especially men. Especially the kind that smirk when you say you have a plan. It would take 2 more years to reach my goal. 2 more winters of rationed heat, missed holidays, worn-out shoes. But I never wavered. I tracked every cent, logged every bill, mapped every step like I was navigating a minefield with my life on the line. Because I was. Because every step forward was one he said I'd never take. And I wanted, more than anything, to live a life so full that if he ever stood across from me again, he wouldn't recognize the woman in front of him. I didn't want revenge, not the kind that screams or burns or breaks. I wanted success. Quiet, permanent, mine. The kind of revenge that blooms in silence and grows roots in stone. The kind that doesn't need an audience, that simply exists. That says, you were wrong, without opening its mouth. And someday, I promised myself, I would walk through the front door of a house I owned, take off my shoes, and let the silence greet me. Not as a punishment, but as a reward. A quiet that was mine. A quiet I had earned. I found the garage by accident. A friend of a coworker knew a retired couple who had converted the back of their property into a guest unit years ago, and now it just sat there. Bare concrete floor, cracked drywall, no insulation, a single bulb dangling from a ceiling that used to leak. They asked for $500 a month, cash, no questions. I said yes before even seeing it. It smelled like rust and old paint when I first stepped in, the kind of smell that clings to your clothes until you stop noticing it. The previous tenant had left behind a broken futon and a mini fridge with a dead roach inside, but it had a door that locked. It had a roof that didn't complain, a space that didn't remind me of him. That alone made it a mansion. I moved in with 2 duffel bags, and a promise to myself that this was temporary. It had to be, because if I stayed too long, I might forget what warmth felt like. I worked during the day, saved at night, and on weekends I started building something else. I had been researching affiliate marketing, digital listings, freelance admin work, anything that didn't require a degree I didn't have, or a clean credit history I couldn't fake. I borrowed a folding table from the diner's storage room and balanced it on 2 crates. That was my desk. My chair was a milk crate with a pillow on top. I didn't have Wi-Fi, so I parked outside the library after work and downloaded everything I could to a USB stick. PDFs on SEO, templates for invoices, old blog posts about digital storefronts. I read them by flashlight. I highlighted entire pages like gospel. I took notes with fingers still sore from coffee burns and mop handles. I began mapping out a system. My system. The first site I built was a disaster. Broken links, misspelled buttons, color schemes that looked like a clown vomited. But I kept going. I watched tutorials in 144p. I taught myself basic code. I registered a domain name using a prepaid debit card I loaded at a corner store. It felt like writing my name in a language no one could take from me. The name was something small, forgettable to most, nothing flashy. But to me it was a declaration. I was building a door where there had only been walls. I offered virtual assistant services for overwhelmed small business owners. Typed proposals with cracked nails and bloodshot eyes. Charged $10 an hour at first, then $12, then $15. Eventually $20. I got reviews. I got return clients. I got emails from strangers saying things like, "You saved me this month," and "I don't know how you do it all." I didn't reply to those emails right away. I just stared at them, blinking hard, because someone was finally saying those words to me. I started using the garage wall as a planner. Post-its, torn notebook paper, dry erase markers on a whiteboard I found in a dumpster behind a school. I tracked every client, every invoice, every deadline. I woke up each day not to an alarm, but to the knowledge that something was finally moving. Not fast, not glamorous, but real, tangible, mine. The work was exhausting. I'd switch from waitressing to freelance editing in the span of an hour, sometimes taking calls from the diner's stockroom during break, whispering about deliverables while flies buzzed overhead. But I didn't care. I had momentum. I had purpose. I had a plan bigger than survival. The first month I earned $300, the second, $550. By the fifth month, I made enough to cover rent without touching diner tips. I allowed myself to buy a space heater. I cried the first night it warmed the room. I bought a used office chair from a warehouse liquidation for $20 and dragged it home 4 blocks on foot. I rearranged the garage, cleaned the walls, covered the cracks with fabric I stapled to plywood. I made a curtain from an old bed sheet. I bought a corkboard and pinned a single photo to it. Me, 3 years younger, smiling despite everything, holding a notebook open to the first budget I ever made after he left. It was barely legible, all scratched out and redone, but I kept it there like a relic, a reminder of how far I'd come from nothing. One day, while reorganizing files, I came across an old folder labeled "His Ideas." It was from a time when I still believed we were building something together. He had dictated concepts to me while pacing the kitchen shirtless, raving about platforms that would change the world, claiming he just needed someone to organize it all. I had taken the notes, made the spreadsheets, created mock-ups he never looked at. I stared at those documents, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. That was the true shift. Indifference. He had burned the foundation of my life to ash, but I had used those ashes as soil. The neighbors never said much. Sometimes they waved. Sometimes they stared. I think they were waiting to see if I was a ghost or a cautionary tale. But I kept to myself. I wasn't there to be understood. I was there to rebuild. I'd take walks in the early morning and count the houses with porches, with lights on in the kitchen, with flowers blooming in tiny boxes nailed to railings. Not out of envy, but out of discipline. I told myself, that's coming. Not maybe. Not if. Just when. The biggest client I landed came from a cold email I sent at 2 a.m., typing on a keyboard missing the A key. A boutique fashion brand on the East Coast. They needed consistent content management, client communication, and back-end logistics. I made a proposal, poured everything into it, and they said yes. They signed a 6-month contract. My rate doubled. I bought a new laptop. Not a high-end one. Just new. Just mine. I touched the plastic casing like it was velvet. I stopped using the milk crate. I bought a proper desk. When I screwed in the legs and sat down for the first time, I looked around the garage, the very space where I once cried myself to sleep under a leaking roof, and I smiled. I was still there, but I wasn't. The idea he once called ridiculous. "You can't make money from thin air," he laughed. "It's not real work," was now the reason I no longer needed to clean bathrooms at dawn. The same man who mocked every ambition I whispered is the same man who now wouldn't recognize the way I walked down the street with my shoulders back. I had become someone I built from the ground up, someone whose worth wasn't borrowed, someone who no longer asked for permission. The garage wasn't permanent. I knew that, but it was sacred. It had held the version of me that refused to die. It had seen my lowest point and still echoed with my typing late into the night. When people ask me what changed my life, they expect a dramatic answer, a windfall, a rescue, but it was none of that. It was a folding table, a cracked screen, and a woman no one believed in, refusing to vanish. And every time I hit send on a new invoice, I whispered thank you, to the silence, to the hunger, to the version of me that didn't give up when she had every reason to. Because that idea, the one he mocked between drags of a cigarette and the smell of failure, that idea was now income, stability, the beginning of something he could never take credit for, and he'd never be able to laugh at it again, because he would never again be close enough to touch what I'd become. There was a house I used to pass on my way home from the bus stop, a squat old thing set back from the street with ivy strangling the fence, and a roofline that sagged like tired shoulders. It wasn't beautiful. Not then. Its paint had faded into something between beige and resignation, the kind of color that speaks of stories left unfinished. The windows were boarded, the porch cracked, but I saw something else. I saw bones. I saw structure. I saw the shape of possibility underneath the wear, like a sentence waiting to be rewritten. It had a crooked tree in the front yard, the kind kids might one day climb, a driveway just wide enough for someone to park after a long day, and a slope in the lawn where I imagined laying down, arms wide, eyes closed, not to sleep, but to finally exhale. The house had a "for sale" sign that had been there so long it was sun-bleached and cracked, the phone number barely legible. I never called it. Not then. Not yet. I didn't have the right to, not with my credit score gasping for air and my income still fragile. But I made it a ritual. Every Tuesday after my shift at the diner and before my night calls, I'd detour half a block out of the way just to walk past that house. Some days I slowed down, lingered on the sidewalk, imagined it with fresh paint and flower boxes, lights warm in the windows. Other days I walked fast, angry at myself for daring to want something so far out of reach, but I always passed it. It became my mile marker, the measure of distance between who I was and who I swore I'd become. One winter morning, I found the front gate hanging open. The padlock was gone, the chain broken. It felt like an invitation, or maybe a test. I looked around. No cars, no neighbors watching. Then stepped inside. The porch groaned under my feet like it remembered me. I put my hand on the door frame, flaking with old white paint, and for a second, I imagined what my name might look like written on a deed. I didn't go in. That would have been too much. But I stood there long enough to hear the wind rush through the gaps in the siding and imagined it as laughter. Imagined the house recognizing me, saying, "You came back." I walked home with my hands in my pockets, not smiling, but more whole. Months passed. My business grew. The garage I lived in had transformed into something close to livable. I no longer checked my bank balance with dread, and bills no longer dictated the rhythm of my heart. I was still tired, still stretched thin, but I was no longer breaking. I had repaired my credit inch by inch, disputed errors, paid down balances that weren't mine, but bore my name. I had a spreadsheet titled The Day List. It tracked everything I needed to reach before I could begin calling myself ready. Emergency savings, down payment minimum, pre-approval letter. I kept that list private, sacred. The world didn't need to know I was aiming for something outrageous, especially not the kind of world that used to roll its eyes when I said the word home. And then, one morning in late spring, I passed the house and the sign was gone. The gate was closed, but the front windows, cleaned. The ivy trimmed back. Someone had started renovation. There were tarps on the roof and a contractor's van in the driveway. My chest collapsed inward like a punctured lung. I stood there for a long time, throat tight, watching a man in overalls carry buckets of nails across what used to be my imagined future. It felt like a betrayal, like the universe had sold the one thing I had quietly loved while I worked 3 jobs and pretended I was content with less. I turned away before they could see my face and walked home in silence. I didn't cry, but something closed in me that night, like a chapter slammed shut by a wind I couldn't stop. 2 days later, I opened my laptop and searched the county property records. Not out of hope, but habit. And then I saw it. Status, pending. Buyer, unlisted. But below that, a contact number for inquiries. It wasn't the sellers, it was the brokers. I stared at the screen for an hour before I picked up the phone. My voice shook when I asked if the property was still available. The woman on the line said the buyer's financing had fallen through, and that they were accepting offers again. My chest buzzed. I hung up, walked outside barefoot, and stood in the middle of the street, looking up at the sky like I needed to verify I was still on Earth. That night I didn't sleep. I paced the garage, reread every number in my savings account, every item on the day list. I was short. Not by much, but enough. I called in a favor the next morning. My old diner manager's husband, who had worked in mortgage lending before retiring. He helped me draft a proposal, offered to be a reference, even gave me the name of a loan officer who liked impossible cases. The pre-approval took 4 days. The offer submission, 2 more. I signed the paperwork with hands that hadn't stopped trembling in hours. And then I waited. I told no one. Not my coworkers, not my clients, not the few acquaintances I had left from the time before. I kept it secret because I was terrified of jinxing it, of watching it disappear again. But on a Friday morning, while sitting at my folding desk with cold tea and a half-eaten banana, the email came in. Offer accepted. Closing date, 30 days. I didn't shout. I didn't jump. I just sat very still and whispered, "I'm coming back." And then I cried. Not for the house, but for the girl who had passed it every week and believed she was too small to deserve it. The first time I unlocked the door, the knob stuck. I jiggled it, pushed harder, and it gave way with a crack like old bones shifting into place. The air inside was thick with sawdust and potential. The walls were bare, wires hanging like veins, floors stripped to concrete. But I could see it. I could see the warm light spilling from pendant lamps over the kitchen counter. I could see the narrow hallway lined with frames I hadn't bought yet. I could see the office in the back room where I'd finally close the laptop at 5 o'clock and walk into my own living room, not someone else's borrowed future. I stepped across the threshold with my palms open at my sides, letting the air wrap around me like a welcome. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't a tenant. I was home. Renovation was slow, expensive, imperfect. I did what I could myself, painting, patching, laying tile with aching knees and too much YouTube courage. I saved for what I couldn't do. I hired women when I could. Tradeswomen, apprentices, survivors like me. They laughed when I told them my story. Not mockery, recognition. They knew. They worked harder. They charged fair. They listened. One even brought me a housewarming gift before the place had walls. A tiny ceramic owl. Wisdom and protection, she said, handing it to me like a secret. The day I moved in, the garage stood empty behind me. I left the chair, the folding table, the corkboard. Let them go like relics in a chapel that had done its job. I didn't look back. Not out of spite, but reverence. It had held me when nothing else could. It had been my womb, my battlefield, my forge, but I didn't belong to it anymore. I had walked past that house for years, whispering promises into the cracks of its foundation. And now, I walked through the front door with keys in hand, wearing clothes I bought with money I earned from ideas he said were worthless. And the best part? He didn't know. Not yet. He had no idea I had returned, that the woman he left with nothing now stood inside the dream he'd laughed at. And when the first letter arrived at my new address, a bill I actually had the means to pay, I smiled, because this time, the name on it didn't hurt. It was mine. All of it was mine. The day I held the key in my hand, I didn't cry. I thought I might. I had imagined it for years, standing on a porch I owned, fingers trembling around a set of brass teeth that turned possibility into permanence. But when it finally happened, the emotion didn't crash over me like a wave. It seeped in quietly, like warm light slipping through the crack of a door you thought would never open. The notary had handed it to me with a soft smile. Her nails painted a soft mauve, the kind of woman who probably lived in a house like this one years ago and forgot what it meant to get there. She slid the final paperwork across the table, asked me to sign on the last line, and when I did, she said, "Welcome home." 2 words that no one had ever said to me without condition. No lease terms, no curfews, no man attached. The house smelled like fresh drywall and dust, like promise and exhaustion. The floors were bare, but level. The windows were clean, but curtainless. The only furniture was a single folding chair and a mattress rolled up in plastic against the wall. I brought in a lamp, the same one from the garage, and plugged it into the socket near the front door. The bulb flickered once, then held. That light hit the walls in such a way that the whole space looked golden, like something sacred. I stood in the middle of the living room and turned slowly in place, taking it all in. The smooth corners of the crown molding, the texture of the plaster I had helped apply, the front door with the new handle I picked out myself from a clearance bin. This was mine. Bought with every coin scraped from coffee tips, every freelance invoice sent at midnight, every bill paid from a phone held together with rubber bands. 5 years. That's how long it took. From the moment he walked out and left me with nothing but bad credit and bruised self-worth, to the afternoon I signed a deed with a name I'd fought to repair. 5 years of silence, of rebuilding, of listening to people laugh behind my back when I said I was saving for a house. 5 years of hearing things like, "The market's impossible," or "You should just rent forever," or "You're too old to start from scratch." But I did. I started with less than nothing and built a life from the ruins he left behind. I kept every bank statement, every credit report, every note scribbled in panic. I stacked them in a plastic crate in my closet like a monument. Not for anyone else. For me. For proof that I hadn't imagined the struggle. That I had been there, dragging myself inch by inch through nights so heavy I thought I'd suffocate under them. The contract I signed was longer than most. My lender was cautious, my terms more rigid, but I didn't care. Every clause was a step further away from the person I used to be, the woman who couldn't get approved for a department store card, who avoided checking her mail, who jumped at every unknown number calling her phone. I had negotiated for myself, learned the language, asked questions I once would have been too embarrassed to voice. I had walked into banks with shoulders square and voice steady, telling strangers in suits that I was worth the risk. And eventually, one of them believed me. Not because I was charming or connected, but because my math added up. Because I had receipts for my resilience. The key itself was unremarkable. Silver, standard cut, no fancy keychain. But it held weight I couldn't measure. I kept it in my front pocket all day, running my thumb along its ridges like braille, like reading a story only I could understand. That night, I unlocked the door slowly, deliberately. No rush, no one waiting inside. Just me. I stepped over the threshold and said it aloud, the thing I'd whispered to myself 100 times in the dark. You did it. My voice sounded strange in the empty space, like it didn't belong to me yet, but it would. I'd fill the rooms with books and silence, and the hum of a life that no longer asked for approval. The backyard was a jungle. Overgrown weeds, tangled vines, the rusted bones of what might have once been a swing set. I stood there the next morning with garden gloves and clippers, sun on my face, and began the slow work of reclaiming it. I cut through thorn and rot, unearthed bricks, found a patch of soil soft enough for planting. I knew nothing about gardening, but I knew about patience, about tending to things no one else believed in. I planted lavender, rosemary, and mint, hardy, forgiving plants, survivors, like me. I wanted the yard to smell like something permanent, something healing. When the housewarming invitations went out, they were simple, just a line of text and a date. No dramatic language, no declarations. But every woman I invited knew what it meant. They were the ones who helped me paint baseboards and revise contracts, who had dropped off soup when I was sick and encouraged me to raise my rates. A few brought friends. One brought her teenage daughter and whispered, "She needs to see this." I had hired caterers, all local, all women-owned, I rented chairs and strung lights across the yard. By dusk, the house glowed. Laughter spilled from the kitchen. Music played low from a speaker by the steps. I stood at the edge of it all, wineglass in hand, and took in the sight like a mother watching her child walk for the first time. Every detail had come from me. Every hand that helped was a hand I had earned, not begged. I walked through the house during the party, barefoot on the new wood floors, smiling at the muddy footprints and empty glasses. This was what healing looked like. Not perfect, but alive. Not quiet, but steady. Not clean, but earned. In the bathroom, I caught my reflection and froze. Not because of how I looked, hair pulled back, cheeks flushed, but because I finally recognized the woman staring back. She wasn't exhausted. She wasn't apologizing for taking up space. She wasn't holding her breath. She had arrived. And somewhere, far away, I imagined him, probably still drifting, still explaining to strangers why none of his failures were his fault, still laughing at the idea that I might one day own a home. But I no longer needed his voice to vanish. It already had, drowned out by the click of a key in a lock he'd never touch, by the rustle of guests settling into chairs on a patio he'd never step foot on, by the soft scrape of my own footsteps, inside a home built not on rage or revenge, but on grit and grace, and the kind of quiet power that never needed an audience to be real. The day after the house became mine, I woke before dawn, lying still on a mattress with no bed frame, staring at the ceiling where moonlight slivered through the uncovered window and dust floated like ghostly confetti. The silence was different now. Not empty, but full. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirp of birds waking in the yard, the creak of wood expanding in the new day's warmth, all of it whispered that I was safe here, that every sound belonged to me, that nothing in this house could be taken away on someone else's whim. I lay there for a long time, hands folded on my chest, listening to the slow rhythm of my own breathing and letting it wash over me like a song I'd nearly forgotten. I made coffee, the first cup brewed in a kitchen with counters bare, except for a single chipped mug and the folded deed that still didn't feel real. I drank it standing at the back door, peering out at the jungle of weeds and broken stones that would one day become a garden. My feet were cold against the tile, my heart calm, like a lake after a storm. I watched the sun rise behind the fence, painting the sky with lavender and gold, and promised myself that nothing, no regret, no bitterness, no echo of his laughter, would ever touch this sanctuary. This house would be built with different hands, different intentions. There would be no shouting here, no slammed doors, no whispered apologies to an unhearing wall. When the paint cans arrived, I lined them up in the hallway like soldiers, each labeled with a name meant to inspire hope. Soft wheat, calm stone, perseverance blue. I spent a day choosing them, not just the colors, but the feeling they evoked, the way light would reflect, the way each room might change through the seasons. I bought rollers and brushes, plastic tarps and blue tape, a stepladder from a thrift store that wobbled but held. I set my playlist to songs I'd played in the garage, anthems of survival, ballads of hope, angry girl rock and gentle acoustic odes to new beginnings. Then I got to work. The first wall was the living room. It faced east, catching the morning sun. So I chose a color almost like new parchment, the color of blank pages waiting for a story. I moved slowly, rolling paint in even stripes from ceiling to baseboard, careful not to miss a spot. My arms ached by the second hour. Paint splattered my wrists, the back of my neck, my jeans. My hair stuck to my forehead, sweat and hope mingling in a glow that wasn't quite exhaustion. With every stroke, I felt something loosen in my chest, like I was covering old bruises, layering over years of doubt and silence, sealing them behind coats of promise that no one would ever peel away. It wasn't easy. I made mistakes. Left streaks where the paint dried too fast, nicked corners with the ladder, splattered the floor despite the tarp. My hands cramped and my shoulders stiffened. At night, I'd collapse on the mattress, muscles throbbing, skin raw, fingers stained with pigment. But I welcomed the pain. It felt different from the ache of heartbreak or humiliation. This pain was purpose, It meant progress. It meant I was transforming, not eroding. Every morning I woke sore, but proud. I painted the kitchen next, choosing a blue the color of early evening, the kind of twilight that makes even the simplest meal feel like a celebration. I pictured friends sitting at the counter, sharing stories over pasta and wine, laughter echoing off the walls where once there had only been empty hunger. The hallway came after, and then the bathroom, the doors, the window frames. I painted the trim in a glossy white so sharp it reflected my face back at me, distorted, smiling despite the sweat. I even painted the insides of the closets, tiny sanctuaries where my clothes, finally free of storage bins and cardboard, hung like flags of surrender to a better future. Some nights I'd sit in the center of the empty living room, back against the wall I'd just painted, sipping tea and listening to the house settle into itself. It creaked and popped, the way all old houses do, but the sounds were no longer ominous. They were reminders that things could break and be mended, that beauty could come from work, not just wishing. When friends visited, they commented on the colors, the brightness, the freshness. "It looks bigger in here," someone said, running a finger along the newly painted sill. "It feels happy." That word struck me. Happy. As if the house itself had absorbed my labor, my sweat, my determination, and converted it into something visible, an aura that no shadow could enter. I didn't tell them how many times I'd cried into the paint, wiping my face with the back of my hand so as not to drip salt water onto a wall that deserved only hope. I didn't explain that each corner covered up the echoes of old words, his words, that used to haunt me late at night. Words like never and useless and unrealistic. Instead, I just nodded, let them fill the rooms with their laughter and music and easy comfort, let the house begin to learn what it meant to shelter joy. I furnished the rooms slowly, piece by piece. A couch from a second-hand shop, cushions covered in fabric I stitched myself on borrowed evenings, a table rescued from a curb, sanded and varnished until it shone, shelves made from salvaged wood, lined with the books I'd collected through years of moving and loss. I hung art prints I bought with my first freelance windfall. Women standing on cliffs, flowers blooming through cracked cement, abstract colors swirling into impossible shapes. My favorite was a photograph of an open window, curtain billowing in a breeze that seemed to whisper, "You're free now." I hung it in the hallway so I'd see it every time I left or returned. Outside, I battled weeds with the same determination I'd once spent surviving heartbreak. I pulled roots from the earth, planted seeds in hopeful rows, watered each one as if it were the first green shoot of a new life. The tree in the front yard, once strangled by neglect, began to bloom by late spring, tiny buds opening to the sunlight, fragile and persistent. I strung solar lights along the fence, so even on nights when loneliness crept close, the house would glow with the quiet certainty that darkness was temporary. I swept the porch, painted the steps, and planted marigolds in chipped teacups along the railing. Each act was a promise kept to myself. With every finished room, I felt the wounds of the past scab over a little more. Every brushstroke was a refusal to let old pain dictate my present. Every nail hammered, every tile laid, every flower bed planted, was an answer to the voice that once told me I would never belong anywhere. I belonged here, not because I earned it, but because I claimed it. Because I built it with my own hands. Every inch hard-won, every moment chosen. Some evenings, when the world was quiet and the house settled into golden dusk, I would walk from room to room, fingertips trailing along the walls I'd painted, whispering thanks, not to fate, not to luck, but to every stubborn part of me that refused to disappear. I healed in this house, not all at once, but gradually, in shades of blue and wheat and stone. In the softness of a chair beneath a reading lamp, in the resilience of roots that found water under broken ground, in the peace of waking every day, in a place no one else could claim or take away. And as I finished the last room, brush poised over the final patch of bare wall, I realized I was no longer covering scars. I was writing new stories, layer by layer, stories of endurance, of grace, of a future written by my own hand. This house, once only a vision mocked by a man who'd left me for dust, now stood radiant in the evening light, a testament not to revenge, but to becoming someone who could finally call herself whole. The garden was never part of the original dream. In the early days, when owning a house felt like wishing for a constellation to shift its orbit just for me, I thought only of shelter, walls that held, a roof that didn't leak, floors beneath my feet that didn't echo with someone else's footsteps or anger. But as the house became real, as my labor layered fresh color over old sorrow, my vision widened. The patch of earth behind the kitchen window, tangled and stubborn, began to call to me, a neglected promise. It was wild when I moved in. Crabgrass and weeds, splinters of broken pots, rusty wire coiled in corners. At night, I'd look out from the back steps, mug of tea warming my hands, and picture it transformed. A place to sit quietly at dusk. A place where something could grow that had not been planted by regret. I started small. A pair of gloves, a trowel borrowed from a neighbor, trash bags for what could not be salvaged. I raked and dug and pulled until my hands blistered, uncovering bottle caps, shards of glass, roots thick as my fingers. It was slow work, frustrating and strangely soothing. Some afternoons I'd lose myself in it for hours, muscles aching, sweat streaking my temples, breath steady and even. Each weed ripped out, each rock unearthed, felt like a splinter pulled from somewhere deeper than flesh. I lost track of time and pain, focused only on clearing space. The ground was hard, sun-baked, reluctant to yield, but I kept at it, returning day after day until the soil softened, until my body remembered how to move with patience instead of panic. Once the earth was ready, I brought home seedlings, herbs and wildflowers, lavender and basil, mint and marigolds, cheap, forgiving things, sold in cracked plastic pots at the edge of the hardware store's parking lot. I arranged them in rough rows, knees pressed to dirt, hands blackened, humming to myself as the shadows grew long. I watered them with a tin can, watching the ground darken, imagining roots threading down into the cool below. I placed stones in a winding path, found old bricks beneath the weeds and laid them as stepping stones. I bought a string of solar lanterns, their bulbs delicate and clouded, and hung them along the fence so the yard would glow after sunset. Each step was deliberate, each choice an act of reclaiming. I wasn't just making a garden. I was making a space where nothing of him could ever grow again. The first flowers bloomed in May, pale blue and stubborn, pressing up through the mulch despite late frosts. I knelt to touch them, fingers gentle, heart unexpectedly light. I realized then that this garden was for no one but me. No children would play here. No lover would stroll with me in the evening. No neighbor would envy my harvest. I didn't need witnesses or approval. I needed the peace that comes from planting something, tending it, and watching it survive. On the evening I hung the last of the lights. The sun was setting slow and orange, washing the house in honeyed glow. The air smelled of cut grass and damp earth, of hope, of things that take root against all odds. I climbed a ladder to drape the last lantern over a sagging limb, my hands trembling with the fine exhaustion that comes from real accomplishment. When I stepped down, the garden was bathed in soft golden orbs, pockets of light scattered among leaves and stems. I turned in a slow circle, seeing it not as it had been, but as it was now, ordered, alive, an extension of my own survival. For the first time in my life, I stood in a space made entirely for myself, by myself, with no apology or explanation owed to anyone. I felt tears rising before I understood why. They came quick, thick, spilling over before I could turn away or compose myself. But I let them fall. I let my face crumple, shoulders shake, breath hiccup in the gathering dark. It wasn't grief this time, or loneliness, or the old gnawing ache of loss. It was release. It was relief. It was gratitude. So pure, it ached. I knelt in the grass and cried, not for the things I'd lost, not for the years spent unraveling someone else's damage, but for the miracle of being here at all. I had survived. I had endured. I had claimed a small, shining corner of the world and made it beautiful. There was no one to see me but the flowers and the birds settling into the branches. And that was enough. More than enough. When the tears dried, I sat on the back steps, hugging my knees, watching the lights blink on one by one. The garden was silent except for the hum of insects, the soft shush of leaves, the distant laughter of strangers from the street beyond. I let the quiet fill me up, soothing the old wounds that still pulsed beneath my scars. I felt a weight lift. Not all of it. Never all. But enough that I could breathe deeply and know I was safe. I realized I was no longer waiting for someone to return, to apologize, to recognize my worth. I was no longer fighting the echo of his voice. I was living beyond it. The house, the garden, the lights, they were mine. Not in the sense of property, but in the sense of belonging. For the first time, I belonged to myself. That night, I left the back door open to let the cool air drift in, let the scent of mint and cut grass settle over my dreams. I slept soundly, body spent, heart calm, no nightmares, no old voices chasing me down corridors of regret, only the steady beat of my own hope, the promise of morning, and the certainty that, whatever storms might come, I would always have this sanctuary. I would always have this proof that I had grown something whole and living from the hardest, most barren ground, that when the world told me I was nothing, I had quietly, patiently, defiantly become everything I ever needed. In the weeks that followed, the garden thrived. Neighbors passing by smiled and nodded, some stopping to admire the blooms, a few asking for cuttings or seeds. I shared gladly, proud and a little shy. There was no competition here, no struggle for control, no bargains struck in secret, only generosity, only connection. I learned the rhythms of sun and rain, the stubbornness of roots, the wild, joyful chaos of living things. I watched as the marigolds repelled insects, as the basil sweetened the air, as lavender drew bees to dance in the daylight. I kept the lights glowing every night, a beacon against the dark, a promise to myself that no matter how small my victories, they would always be celebrated. And sometimes, late at night, I would step outside, barefoot in the cool grass, and lift my face to the sky. I would let the soft light wash over me, let the old pain fade, let the present fill every inch of me. I didn't need to be seen. I didn't need to be praised. It was enough to exist, to endure, to flourish. It was enough to know that, after everything, I had made a place for myself in the world, a place that was quiet and safe, and finally my own. In the weeks leading up to the housewarming, my days blurred into a choreography of anticipation and labor. Each morning began in the garden, dew soaking through my shoes as I checked on the swelling lavender buds and the wayward mint that threatened to take over the beds. The afternoons were spent inside, adjusting furniture, wiping windows until the sunlight cut in like gold blades and spilled over the hardwood I had varnished with hands still nicked from renovation. Sometimes the silence of my house startled me, the utter lack of tension or raised voices, the gentle hush of a space untouched by anyone's expectations but mine. I breathed in the quiet, my breath steady and deep, savoring the fullness of a life orchestrated solely by my own choices. The invitations were handwritten, each card deliberate and spare, as if to say, "You are part of this, you belong here." I sent them to the women who had arrived at the hardest moments, co-workers who helped me study between shifts, neighbors who lent tools, friends who listened to me fumble through hope and defeat without ever rushing me to move on. Some brought sisters, daughters, friends of friends who'd heard about my story and wanted to see the proof that healing was possible, that escape and reinvention weren't fairy tales told in support groups, but living, breathing facts. I kept the list small, but every name was sacred. Every woman who RSVP'd yes became another thread in the tapestry I had been weaving since the first night I slept on the garage floor. Planning the party felt almost like staging a gentle rebellion. I hired a local string quartet composed entirely of young women, musicians who played Bach and Billie Eilish with equal passion, whose laughter filled my living room on rehearsal day and whose resilience matched my own. I ordered candles by the dozen, little glass jars with wicks that flickered in time with the music, their scents mingling into something floral and clean, a fragrance that belonged nowhere but here. I found a caterer, a woman from the next neighborhood over who ran her kitchen with military precision and warm, easy humor. We sat at my dining table and planned a menu of small, rich things, stuffed mushrooms, finger sandwiches, honeyed figs, slices of chocolate tart dense as a secret. Every detail mattered, every choice deliberate. I wanted my guests to taste what survival could be, what peace could feel like on the tongue. The day before, I strung fresh lights along the fence and into the tree's lowest branches, layering over the solar lanterns with strands that glimmered even after the sun was gone. I arranged chairs in a loose circle on the lawn, so no one would feel isolated, so every face would be seen and every voice could be heard. I moved the couch so that the windows would stay open, letting laughter spill out into the night air and drift across the block. The house had never known celebration before, but I could sense it settling in, learning to hold joy as gently as it once absorbed pain. I kept myself busy with errands, polishing silverware, folding napkins, touching up paint in corners only I would notice. I scrubbed the bathroom tile until it gleamed, scattered rose petals in a glass bowl beside the soap, filled pitchers with water and lemon slices to catch the sun, and scatter prisms across the kitchen counter. I wore a dress I had found months before in a consignment shop, simple and soft, a color halfway between blush and certainty. My hair was pinned back, hands clean but scarred, face flushed not with nerves, but with the certainty that no one here would see me as less than whole. The guests arrived slowly, cars pulling up along the curb, laughter growing as women spilled onto the sidewalk and into my yard. They brought wine, potted herbs, loaves of bread wrapped in towels, bouquets of wildflowers from their own gardens. Their voices filled the house, rising and falling in harmonies I had never heard in these rooms before. We toasted with sparkling cider and champagne, clinked glasses to survival, to hard-won happiness, to the kind of kinship that can only be forged in adversity. The musicians played from the porch, their notes spiraling into the golden dusk, drawing neighbors to their windows, inviting the whole block to wonder what new thing was blooming here. The food disappeared quickly. Plates passed hand to hand, crumbs trailing across the grass. Someone started a story about the worst boss she'd ever had, and soon the circle erupted into stories of indignity and escape, of triumph snatched from the jaws of disaster. We talked about love and betrayal, about the men who thought they could define us, and the women who taught us how to live for ourselves. I moved among them, filling glasses, laughing until my sides ached, collecting moments the way children collect shells at the tide's edge, each one unique, each one proof of the journey's length. It was nearly midnight when the last of the candles began to gutter, their flames trembling in the gentle breeze. The musicians packed their cases and hugged me goodbye, their eyes bright in the reflected glow of the garden lights. Some guests lingered on the porch, shoes off, voices soft, savoring the comfort of a place where nothing was expected but presence. I found myself standing at the edge of the lawn, looking back at my house as if seeing it for the first time, a beacon in the darkness, a warm mouthful of laughter and light. And then, out of the night, he appeared. Not in a grand gesture, not in a whirlwind of regret, but quietly, almost apologetically, a stranger at the edge of a world he'd once scorned. He stood outside the gate, uncertainty in the set of his shoulders, another man at his side, his latest confidant perhaps, or simply someone to bolster his courage. They looked small in the soft glow, two silhouettes cut against the safety I had built. My heart did not leap or race. I felt only a calm curiosity, the kind you feel watching rain slide down a window, harmless now that you're warm inside. He did not call my name. He waited, hesitant, for someone to notice him, for someone to declare or protest. But I was the one who walked over, bare feet pressing into the cool grass, dress brushing my knees. I opened the gate and let them in, meeting his eyes with a composure I didn't have to fake. He stammered a greeting, as if unsure what role to play. I didn't offer hospitality, didn't reach for old scripts. I simply said, "You may stay, if you don't speak." My voice was clear, gentle, unyielding. He nodded, chastened, and followed me into the circle of light. He took a seat on the edge, hands clasped tightly, eyes darting between the laughter, the music, the women who paid him no mind. He watched me pour wine for a new friend, watched me joke with the caterer, watched me dance barefoot with the string quartet as they played their last song. He did not interrupt, did not explain, did not try to reclaim any part of what he once had the power to destroy. The night flowed on, rich and unbroken. Every moment an affirmation that his silence was not an absence, but a kind of grace. By the time the last guest drifted out into the early morning, the house was quiet again, scattered with empty glasses and echoes of laughter. I locked the door, turned off the garden lights, and stood for a moment in the hush, hands on the cool surface of the kitchen counter, feeling the world settle around me like a blanket. He was gone, vanished as quietly as he had arrived, leaving nothing behind but the faint impression of a shadow at the edge of the celebration. And I, no longer defined by his presence or absence, found myself smiling, not for anyone else, not out of relief or victory, but from the simple, quiet certainty that this life, this night, this home, was entirely, unshakably, beautifully mine. I noticed him before anyone else did, just beyond the edge of the light, lingering beneath the old sycamore where the sidewalk met the garden path. He wore the same kind of jacket he'd always worn, faded denim, sleeves pushed up despite the night's chill, collar stiff with stubbornness. There was another man beside him, younger, sharper around the edges, eyes darting between the gate and the soft chaos inside, as if weighing the merits of entering a world he did not understand. For a moment, neither man moved, silhouettes etched by the glow of the garden lanterns, as if caught between past and present, guests at the threshold of a story they no longer shaped. For a fleeting second, I saw myself as I'd once been, waiting for his approval, analyzing his silences, aching for his attention, so tuned to his moods that I lost the sound of my own voice. But that woman no longer lived here. She had been rebuilt, floor by floor, wall by wall, from the ache of absence and the quiet, steady labor of self-reclamation. I smoothed the skirt of my dress, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and crossed the lawn, feeling the cool grass beneath my bare feet, each step unhurried, deliberate, unburdened by fear. He noticed me approach and straightened, as if bracing for a verdict, a sentence, some inevitable accounting. He did not smile. I felt no anger, only a measured distance, like watching an old movie you can recite by heart, but no longer believe in. Up close, his features were older, thinner, a touch of gray threading his hair. The air between us held the faintest charge, the last echo of all we'd once endured together, but it quickly dissolved in the presence of so many witnesses to my new life. His friend glanced down, perhaps embarrassed, perhaps just unsure of his role in a scene he hadn't scripted. We exchanged no pleasantries, no apologies, no rehashing of old wounds. I looked him in the eye and waited for him to speak, but he offered nothing, his gaze dropping to his shoes. I realized then that his presence here was not a threat or an intrusion. It was a relic, an artifact washed ashore by the tide of memory. The life I'd made was so robust, so vital, that he could not possibly overshadow it now. I could afford kindness without risk, boundaries without cruelty. I could let him in and keep him at a distance, all at once. So I opened the gate, the latch clicking as if releasing the last chain of obligation, and said, "You can stay, if you don't speak." My tone was even, not sharp, not cold, but final, an invitation with conditions shaped by all the lessons learned in his absence. He nodded once, relief flickering across his face, and stepped forward, the friend trailing in his wake, their movements hesitant, almost reverent. I led them into the glow of the garden, among the laughter and music and fragrance of mint and marigolds, weaving them into the gathering like two more shadows at the perimeter of a celebration that belonged to someone else. The other guests barely noticed them. The women who had helped me build this night, painters and poets, mothers and daughters, neighbors and colleagues, remained wrapped in their conversations, their stories, their collective joy. The string quartet played under the lanterns, their harmonies sweet and unself-conscious, carrying into the darkness beyond the fence. I poured another glass of wine for a friend who had traveled across the city, my hands steady, my smile unforced. The memory of his laughter, once so wounding, felt distant and weightless, a sound lost in the rustle of leaves and the gentle hum of friendship. He found a seat near the back, almost hidden by the shadows of the tree, and sat quietly, eyes never settling, hands folded in his lap. His friend said little, studying the other guests with the wary curiosity of someone eavesdropping on a language he didn't speak. The two of them were out of place here, but not disruptive, not malignant. They were observers now, not actors. I gave them nothing. No explanations, no forgiveness, no justification for the world they found themselves watching. I simply allowed them to see what I had made. That was enough. As the evening wore on, I danced with a woman whose resilience had inspired me to raise my rates, clinked glasses with the neighbor who had let me borrow her stepladder, and listened to the quartet's final set with my feet pressed into the warm flagstones, my body loose and strong, my laughter unguarded. I never once looked back to where he sat, but I felt his eyes following me through the garden's glow. It was not longing I sensed from him, nor regret, but something closer to disbelief, a stunned recognition that the future he'd once mocked had unfolded in spite of his absence, or perhaps because of it. When the musicians packed away their instruments, when the candles burned low and the guests began to drift toward the porch, I caught his gaze. For the briefest moment, I saw the man I'd loved and the boy he'd never outgrown, both flickering beneath the mask of age. I felt nothing sharp or bitter, only a clear, quiet sense of release, a lightness in my bones that comes from laying down a burden you carried too long. He looked away, and I knew he understood. I had moved on, not with vengeance, not with anger, but with a life so wide and deep, it left no room for him to fill. As the last guests filtered out into the blue haze of dawn, I gathered the empty glasses, the scattered plates, the soft remnants of celebration. He and his friend slipped away into the street, leaving nothing behind but the faint imprint of their presence, and the certainty that they could not return. I locked the gate, turned off the garden lights, and stood for a moment in the hush, letting the memory of the night settle over me like a gentle rain. The house was quiet once more, holding only the laughter, the music, the shared triumph of women who had survived and made something beautiful from the broken pieces. I stood in the kitchen, fingers resting on the cool countertop, feeling the world shrink back to a peaceful silence. The man who once defined my boundaries was now a ghost at the edge of my story, a silent observer to the reality he had never believed possible. I didn't need to tell him anything. My life spoke for itself, bright and whole and utterly, gloriously beyond his reach. He chose a seat in the garden's furthest corner, half shadowed by the sycamore and the thick rope of ivy clinging to the fence, a place where lamplight turned gentle and the air tasted of distant laughter. I saw him as I circled the party, filling glasses and sharing stories, never quite forgetting the silent figure on the periphery. He sat with his knees drawn close, one hand curled loosely around the stem of an untouched glass, the other resting palm down against his thigh, as if to anchor himself in a world that felt suddenly alien. His friend hovered near the buffet table, nibbling uncertainly, as if the food and the music might explain to him the alchemy that had transformed a ruin into a sanctuary, bitterness into something that tasted almost sweet. No one paid them special attention. The women gathered around the fire pit, passing plates of bread and fruit, sharing soft confessions and bold jokes, their voices overlapping in that familiar, affectionate way of those who have weathered long winters together. The music from the porch shifted between melancholy and exuberance, violins skimming through the night air, a melody for healing and risk, and every small act of bravery that had brought us all here. I moved among my guests with ease, pausing to listen, to laugh, to offer a refill or a hug, feeling at every moment the solidity of the earth beneath my feet, the rightness of my own name spoken without hesitation or fear. He watched it all unfold, a silent observer in a world he once claimed to understand. His gaze flicked from face to face, lingering sometimes on the curve of my jaw as I threw my head back in laughter, or on the arc of my hands as I guided a neighbor's child through the garden path. I caught him watching me more than once, not with hunger or regret, but with a kind of puzzled awe, the look of a man realizing he was never the author of the story, only a chapter in a book whose pages he could no longer edit. He tried at first to catch my eye, to offer a half smile or a nod, but I was always in motion, orbiting the sun of my own celebration, never once pulled into his shadow. The evening stretched, the garden flickering with lantern light, and the promise of rain that never came. The scents of rosemary and marigold drifted on the breeze, mingling with the smoke from a neighbor's grill and the sharp tang of spiced cider. I watched my guests move easily through the space I had shaped, settling onto cushions, perching on steps, their conversations weaving a tapestry of survival and hope. I saw women swap numbers, plan future dinners, share advice on everything from home repairs to broken hearts. In their laughter and gentle teasing, I heard the affirmation I had once begged from the wrong person, proof that I was not alone, not doomed to the silence he'd left behind. He never spoke, not once. True to the condition I'd set, he held his tongue, biting back whatever explanations or excuses he might have rehearsed on the walk over. I wondered what it felt like to sit inside a story that moved on without you, to be surrounded by proof of your own irrelevance, to realize that your absence had been not a wound, but a doorway. He looked smaller here, diminished, as if the night's joy siphoned some color from his skin, leaving him faded, a ghost in a room of living people. His friend, restless and awkward, murmured a few words to him, but received only a distracted nod in reply. When the string quartet played their final song, I stood at the kitchen window, watching the garden from a distance. Candles guttered, fireflies tangled in the hedges, the sound of shoes scuffed quietly on flagstones. I watched as he shifted in his chair, fingers tightening around the stem of his glass, eyes glistening with something unspoken, not tears, not anger, but the unmistakable confusion of a man unaccustomed to silence, to boundaries, to power that no longer bent for him. He stared into the middle distance, past the garden, and the lights, and the laughter, seeing perhaps not only what he had lost, but how little he'd understood of what had always been growing in the dark behind his back. As the night cooled, I made rounds with a tray of late desserts, bitter chocolate, sugared orange slices, tiny cakes dusted with lavender. I paused by his chair only once, long enough to offer the tray without a word, long enough to watch him hesitate, eyes flickering up to meet mine. He did not reach for a cake. He did not thank me. He only lowered his gaze, lips pressed tight, and let the moment pass. I felt nothing for him then, no spike of pride or vengeance, no urge to press the wound or offer comfort. The gap between us was too wide now, the life I had built too real and solid to be threatened by a shadow. I turned away, the tray balanced on my palm, moving through the garden as if gliding through water, buoyed by the ease of my own strength. He remained in his chair until the very end, a stillness at the edge of celebration. Guests left in pairs and trios, voices hushed and happy as they moved through the gate, some stopping to thank me, others promising to return with tools or flowers or new recipes. The house emptied slowly, settling into a peaceful hush, broken only by the sound of crickets and the distant purr of traffic. I collected glasses and plates, snuffed candles, folded blankets. He watched, still silent, until his friend finally touched his shoulder, a gentle summons back to the world outside my garden. He stood, stiff, as if unused to the weight of his own body, and followed the other man through the gate. They left without a word, vanishing into the soft, forgiving dark, leaving nothing behind but the imprint of a chair on the lawn and a glass half full of untouched wine. Alone again, I stood on the porch, letting the hush of midnight settle over me, breathing in the mingled sense of soil and sweetness and newness. The house was safe, quiet, utterly my own. The silence he left behind was not empty. It was sacred, filled with the memory of laughter, the promise of morning, the subtle satisfaction of having moved so far beyond the need for approval or explanation. I washed the last glass, turned off the lights, locked the door. I slept in sheets still scented by fresh air and lavender, not haunted by the memory of his presence, but soothed by the gentle conviction that he was only a visitor now, a spectator at the edge of a life he could never enter again. And when I woke the next morning, sunlight streaming through windows I had painted, I felt light, unburdened, whole. The world outside was unchanged, indifferent to the dramas that had once consumed me. But within these walls, in the garden, under the patient eyes of flowers and the sturdy branches of the sycamore, I had crafted a peace so deep that not even the quiet gaze of my past could disturb it. He had come. He had watched. He had sat in silence and seen what endurance could build from brokenness. And I, for the first time, was truly, utterly free. There is a moment, sometimes, when you are surrounded by people who have carried their own secret burdens, when a hush falls, not of awkwardness, but of mutual recognition. That night, as the string quartet played beneath the lattice of garden lights, as the air shimmered with music and laughter and the clink of glasses, I found myself standing at the heart of a celebration, built not on triumph, but on quiet survival. I looked at the faces around me, each woman a world unto herself, each bearing scars invisible to the eye, and strengths that could not be measured by the softness of their smiles or the gentleness of their hands. Some were old friends. Some were newcomers drawn by a rumor, a whisper, the promise that this night was for those who had learned, through loss or longing or relentless hope, to make something beautiful out of what was broken. The music spilled from the porch and into the garden, the violinist's bow a streak of silver in the candlelight, the cellist's notes grounding us all. Someone passed a bottle of sparkling wine, its chill sweating through my palm as we poured glass after glass, raising them high in the air for toasts that grew more honest with each passing hour. To houses bought and lost, to jobs survived, to mornings faced after sleepless nights, to children who called or did not call, to freedom in whatever form we had managed to wrest from the grip of what once seemed impossible. Someone toasted to forgiveness, someone else to fury, a third to the stubbornness that outlasted sorrow. The words braided together in the air, a garland of courage, looping from one guest to the next, until even the quietest among us was seen and known. A song began, slow at first, swelling with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Without thinking, I reached for the hand of a friend who had fought her own long war for independence, and she for mine. Soon we were spinning barefoot in the grass, our skirts tangling, laughter ringing out so clear that neighbors paused in their routines to watch from their windows. More joined us, women who had once slept on sofas, women who had sent angry letters to landlords, women who had sat in the parking lots of grocery stores with the engine running just for a moment of stillness. We danced in a loose, jubilant circle, arms raised, faces lifted to the canopy of stars above the city's glow. I caught sight of him, my former lover, still seated at the edge of the party. His expression was unreadable, his body tense, eyes fixed on the living proof that the world had not only continued without him, but had flourished. Yet it did not matter. Not his presence, not his silence, not even the shadow of his memory. The joy that swelled around me was too large to be eclipsed by any old pain. We called for more music, for an encore, for songs we half remembered from younger years. Someone, a poet by profession, recited a verse about windows thrown open at midnight, about air that tastes of change. Another told a story, her voice trembling at first, and then gaining strength, about the night she walked away from a man who once told her she was nothing, how she'd packed a single suitcase and stepped into the future, wearing shoes a size too small, simply because they were hers. We cheered, we cried, we laughed until the laughter turned soft and tired, settling in our bones like warmth at the end of a long winter. The musicians, caught up in our mood, moved from the porch to the garden path, their instruments glowing beneath the lanterns. I danced with a neighbor who once hid bruises with foundation and scarves, with a young mother who had gone back to school at 40, with a woman who'd traveled across the state just to witness what healing looked like. There was no awkwardness, no need for small talk. We knew each other by our survival, by the language of resilience we all spoke without words. I felt the grass cool beneath my feet, the press of other hands in mine, the rise and fall of laughter like waves on a gentle shore. In that space, time thinned, past and future blurred, leaving only the pulse of the present, the certainty that we had arrived, that the road behind us had not been wasted, but woven into the fabric of this night. For the first time in years, I felt truly and utterly unafraid. The house glowed behind me, windows open to the night, every room painted by my own hands, every lamp and chair and vase placed just so. I thought of the garden I'd wrestled from ruin, of the debts I'd paid, of the scars that had faded, not because time had erased them, but because I had written better stories over their ache. I caught sight of the friend who had brought her teenage daughter. She sat on the porch steps, watching us with wide eyes, seeing in our celebration the possibility that pain need not be permanent, that life could, in fact, get brighter. I gave her a smile, quick and fierce, as if to say, "Remember this. Carry it forward. Know that whatever sorrow may come, there are nights like this waiting for you on the far side of heartbreak." Eventually, the music quieted and the fire burned low. People drifted toward the house, toward their cars, toward beds where dreams might finally come easier. I stood for a while in the quiet, letting the glow of the lanterns and the warmth of so many hands linger on my skin. The night had become a memory even as it was ending, a promise sealed by laughter and the gentle reassurance of community. I looked once more to where he had sat, but the chair was empty, the friend gone. There was no need to wonder what he felt, no need to assign meaning to his silence. His chapter in my story was closed, gently but with certainty. All that remained was gratitude, for having survived, for having grown, for having claimed a joy he could never touch. As I turned off the garden lights and closed the door behind me, I knew that this night would be one I returned to in the years ahead, not as proof of triumph over him, but as a celebration of every small, patient act that had carried me here. I climbed the stairs to bed, feet sore, heart light, humming the last song the quartet had played. The world was wide and welcoming. The future was my own. And in the hush that followed, I slept in the peace of my own making, surrounded by the echoes of women who had taught me how to dance again. Long after the last of the laughter faded, and the garden fell silent, but for the crickets and the gentle sway of the lights in the sycamore, I was left alone to gather the night's remains. The air was thick with the perfume of trodden grass and warm bread, the tart sweetness of wine lingering on every surface. I moved slowly, stacking plates, collecting glasses and napkins, pulling the melted candles from their holders, the wax cool and pliant between my fingers. There was a reverence to the work, as if in touching every remnant I was preserving the spirit of the night, making it last just a little longer before the spell broke, and Monday morning returned to reclaim the world. The kitchen was still bright from the party, the countertops scattered with crumbs and peels and the last hunks of cheese drying at the corners. But it was the table that made me pause, the way it held the memory of the meal, the evidence of voices and hands, the living proof of the circle we'd made. There was a plate, set apart from the rest, as if forgotten or left for a latecomer. On it sat a careful portion of food, untouched. A wedge of tart, a cluster of grapes, half a roll of bread split and buttered, a curl of rosemary perched atop a slice of cold chicken. The napkin folded beside it was still creased, unsmudged, a glass of wine beside it filled nearly to the rim. It was the plate I had set in front of him when I made my rounds with the tray, the one he'd looked at but never touched, his hand hovering and then retreating, the moment of decision playing across his face like a struggle against hunger he dared not satisfy. I stood for a long time, letting the stillness wash over me, my own hands pressed to the edge of the table, steady and unhurried. I remembered every meal I had shared with him before, how food had become both ritual and battlefield, how I'd learned to serve myself last, to accept the smallest cut, the coldest portion, the leftovers after his appetite had been sated. I remembered the arguments that started over seasoning or spending, the way every dinner was an audition for approval I'd never win. And I remembered the silence, too, the cold peace that followed when I gave up asking for kindness and simply let the meal end in exhaustion. The full plate before me now was a silent answer to all those old hungers, a message written in bread and grapes and untouched tart, a testament that I no longer cooked or lived to please him, that my home was no longer his feast. Outside, the garden lights flickered and hummed in the breeze. The chairs were scattered in loose arcs, bearing the imprint of laughter and the memory of hands held tight. I stepped out into the night, carrying the plate and the glass with me, feet bare against the flagstones, the night air cool and full of promise. The grass was damp, the garden fragrant with mint and rain, the old tree creaking gently as if settling into a long sleep. I knelt beneath its lowest branch, the plate in my lap, the wine warming in my palm. I thought of all the things I'd hungered for. Gentle words, safe laughter, the simple reassurance that I was allowed to want. I thought of the years I had spent waiting to be invited to the table, to be welcomed instead of tolerated, cherished instead of endured. With a quiet, deliberate movement, I set the plate at the base of the tree, pouring the wine over the roots, watching as the earth drank it in. I whispered a small thanks to the tree, to the garden, to the woman I had become, to the girl I had been who learned to wait for scraps and grew strong on hope instead. I let the night hold me, unafraid, not lonely, but complete, surrounded by the gentle chorus of insects and the knowledge that my hunger had changed. I did not crave his approval. I did not mourn his silence. I did not need to prove anything anymore. Inside, I washed the last dishes, folded the last napkins, blew out the final candles. The house felt soft, cleansed, luminous from within. The music of the evening played on in my head, blending with the memory of dancing barefoot in the grass, the sensation of warm hands and warm light. I climbed the stairs and paused at the window, looking out over the dark yard where the garden lights burned steady and sure. The plate beneath the tree was invisible now, claimed by the night, absorbed into the cycle of earth and root and leaf. I slept that night without dreams, my body sinking into the mattress, every muscle slack with gratitude. The old anxieties did not stir. I did not worry about tomorrow or about what had been lost. I was filled with the quiet certainty that nothing taken from me had ever been essential, that everything I needed had been forged in the fire of endurance, in the soft, unbreakable resolve of survival. I woke at dawn to birdsong and the gentle brightness of a world that had remade itself for me. The kitchen gleamed, the garden waited, the house, my house, breathed quietly around me. Later, as I walked through the garden with a cup of coffee, dew soaking the cuffs of my jeans, I saw the plate still resting at the base of the tree, empty now, the bread and fruit claimed by some grateful animal or carried off by the night wind. The wine had sunk into the ground, staining the earth dark. I smiled, a small private smile, and bent to brush a stray crumb from the grass. There was no regret, no bitterness, only the sweetness of knowing that I could feed the world and still keep myself whole. That evening, I wrote a note to myself and tucked it into a drawer with the other small mementos of my journey: a house key, a paint-splattered brush, a faded receipt for the first bag of lavender seeds. I wrote, "You are not what you lost. You are what you have planted, what you have grown." I let the words settle, sure and unadorned, the quiet epilogue to a story of hunger and fulfillment. I made dinner for myself, simple and nourishing, setting the table with care, lighting a single candle just to watch the flame dance in the gathering dusk. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, feeling the full measure of my own company. And in that stillness, in the fullness of a night without ghosts or apologies, I understood at last that the feast I'd been searching for was never his to give or withhold. It was here, in the light, in the laughter, in the peace that lingered after the guests were gone and the music faded, in the sweet, satisfied hush of being finally, completely fed. In the days after the party, when the scent of marigold and candle wax still clung to the screens, and every cushion in the living room held the faint warmth of a guest's laughter, the world around me became quietly new. My garden was littered with the soft debris of celebration. Corks nestled in the grass, a crumpled napkin beneath the rosemary, a trail of shoe prints vanishing into the dew. I moved through the house with a calm so deep it felt foreign at first, the sort of peace that comes not from absence of pain, but from the sure knowledge that what once hurt can no longer reach you. Every morning I opened the curtains and let in the light, the walls gleaming with the layered memory of all the days I had survived. I worked, I cooked, I tended to the plants, and at night I let the hush settle in without dread. Even the echo of his voice, that old refrain of, "You'll never have more than me," had lost its bite, fading now to a dull thrum, like distant thunder on a bright day. It was almost a week after the party when I saw him again. I was in the front yard, on my knees pulling weeds near the walkway, hands caked with dirt, hair tied back, the sky brilliant with late afternoon. He approached quietly, as if uncertain, his footsteps slow and unhurried, eyes lowered to the ground. There was no swagger, none of the offhand arrogance that once marked his every movement. just a hesitant vulnerability, a kind of invisible weight dragging behind him. He stopped at the edge of the walk, where the grass met the concrete, and cleared his throat softly, hands fidgeting in the pockets of that old denim jacket, faded and shrunken by time. I looked up, shielding my eyes from the sun, waiting for him to speak. He searched my face for anger, for longing, for any trace of the girl he used to command so easily, but found only a quiet readiness, the kind that does not need to perform. He tried to smile, then seemed to think better of it. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the garden as if the riot of color and green might somehow explain the person standing before him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady. "You look well," he said. "You really did it." His words hung between us. Not accusation or apology, just a statement of fact so simple that I found myself nodding, neither proud nor defensive, just grounded in the truth. There was a time, not so long ago, when such a moment would have sent my heart spinning, would have filled my mind with arguments, pleas for acknowledgement, the frantic need to be seen and understood. But now, standing barefoot in the dirt, feeling the warmth of the earth rise into my skin, I realized how little I needed from him. I did not want an explanation for the past, nor an inventory of regrets. I did not crave his remorse or forgiveness or even his admiration. He could not give me what he had once withheld, because I had already found it within myself and among the women who gathered at my table, in the lavender that bloomed despite the clay and stones, in the work-worn tools, and the house that shone like a lantern against the dusk. He asked timidly if he could walk the garden. I gestured for him to go ahead and return to my weeding, unconcerned by the crunch of his footsteps along the path. I watched him move among the herbs and flowers, running his hands absently over the mint, pausing beneath the old tree, gazing up into its branches. He stopped at the spot where I had left the untouched plate, now bare earth, and looked back at me as if waiting for an explanation I would never owe. I joined him there, hands stained and unashamed, and for a long moment, we stood together in silence, each of us listening to the birds, the faint clatter of a neighbor's bicycle, the easy rhythm of a world no longer ruled by hunger or want. He started to speak again, words tumbling out in fits and starts, regret for the way things ended, admissions of things he could not fix, memories of laughter and warmth twisted by all that came after. I listened, not because I needed his story, but because I could now hear it without being caught by the undertow. He spoke of dreams gone wrong, of the loneliness that followed him, of seeing me that night among my friends, and knowing, finally, that I had built something he could never enter, never undo. I nodded, accepting the shape of his truth without the need to wrap it around myself. He fell silent, waiting for absolution or anger, or perhaps an invitation back into my life, but I had nothing to give. The space between us was gentle, but impassable. A river crossed, a bridge burned with no ill will, just necessity. I told him softly that I wished him peace, that I hoped he found a corner of the world to tend as I had tended this one. His shoulders slumped in quiet understanding, a long-held tension releasing as if he too was finally stepping out of a story that no longer belonged to him. He thanked me, not for the past, but for the moment, for the garden, for the evidence that joy could root and flourish after all. And then he left, not looking back, his figure shrinking against the horizon, swallowed by the afternoon light and the promise of something new. Inside, I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, the water running clear at last. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the world carry on, untroubled, uninterrupted, indifferent to the drama that once consumed me. My house was quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was full of everything I had made and become. I sipped the tea, breathing in the mingled scents of earth and mint, and let myself rest. Let myself believe in the softness of the day, in the possibility that peace was not only earned, but deserved. It would have been easy to call this revenge, a reckoning, a poetic justice, the final turning of the wheel. But as I gazed into the pale blue sky, the garden alive with bees and birds, and the trembling of petals in the breeze, I understood that the truest victory was not seeing him diminished or undone. It was standing before him whole and needing nothing. It was in the certainty that I could meet his eyes and not flinch, could let him speak and not bleed, could wish him well and mean it, because I had already claimed every scrap of joy he tried to deny me. That evening, I gathered the last of the garden's herbs, chopped mint and rosemary into a dish cooked for myself alone. I ate at the table, bathed in the honeyed light of the setting sun, windows open to the gentle hush of night. I left the dishes to soak, curled onto the couch with a book and a blanket, and let the sweet fatigue of a day well lived settle deep into my bones. As sleep crept close, I offered one final, silent thank you to the girl I had been, to the women who held me up, to the man who left, to the long, wild path that led me home. I closed my eyes, safe and sure in the knowledge that I was, at last, beyond needing, beyond wanting, beyond revenge, simply and entirely free.